imposed barriers to socialism. I think I can add to the no platforming, other such, a couple of other examples: ban on factions, ban on permanent factions, ban on factions not publicly disclosed to the leadership, ban on correspondence between members of different branches of the same organization outside of its secret conduct of internal affairs of a party, controlled by the centre on local authorities' publications, except insofar as political differences force a split, and so on and so on and so on. Virtuously non-obvious what the subject matter is, but the underlying linkage is the question: what is necessary to self-government and political democracy? And what we're concerned with is primarily the right to receive communication and information. The point is not the right to, quote, self-expression, freedom of self-expression, which could mean anything under the sun, but the right to access the information and to access knowledge about what's being disputed, about debates and about issues of this sort. And what I'm going to do is to approach this question primarily in a very abstract way, because all of these different things, the Chatham House rule, which is about leaderships carrying on discussions in confidence, cabinet confidentiality is another aspect of the same matters. Safe spaces is about rules which control what can and can't be said, and also about forms of secret delation of disciplinary proceedings conducted in secret or subject to confidentiality. No platforming, again, is about excluding people from hearing things as much as people from saying things, and so on and so on. What I'm going to do is to approach this in a much more abstract way, and I'm going to approach it from three angles. The first angle is the needs of socialist production, considered for the moment, just for the moment, in abstraction from the question of class. The second is the needs of working class self-organization in general, considered briefly and for the moment in abstraction from the struggle for socialism. And the third is from the needs of working class political action, considered specifically and in relation to the nature of the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. So my first point, this is in a sense absolutely banal. Market capitalism involves the coordination of human productive activities through markets and money. In the first place, there is insufficient gold, silver, and copper in the world for commodity money to satisfy the circulation needs of a late feudal economy, or indeed late antique economy, let alone a capitalist economy. In order for capitalist economy to function, it's necessary to have credit money, not just commodity money. And in order to have credit money, it's necessary to have the state. And in addition, actually, this has been shown by a woman called Yadira Gonzalez de Lara, in order to have credit money, it's necessary for the state to discriminate against foreigners, because otherwise it's too easy for people to just run away from their debts. Credit money involves I pay X on the basis with the Y's promise to pay me. Okay, so we need credit money, and we therefore need the state, and we actually need multiple states. We need the territorial state, which discriminates against outsiders in order for credit money to function. And the inherent logic of that is that there is a dynamic towards war, which we can see playing out right now, both in terms of US war threats against Iran, US and Israeli war threats against Iran, and in relation to the policy of the United States of encircling China, analogous, very closely analogous to the policy of the United Kingdom of encircling Germany in the period between 1900 and 1914. So that the inherent logic of capitalism leads to the persistent recurrence of war. We can talk about, in a sense, the First World War taking place in 1689 to 1714, the Second World War in 1756 to 1763, the Third World War in 1791 to 1815, the Fourth World War then in 1914-18, and the fifth in 1939-45. This recurrent return of war. Secondly, capitalism is about individuals making their own choices individually on the basis of the information that they have themselves, and we coordinate these activities through money and markets. But the claim that coordination works, that is to say, the claim that there is a general tendency to equilibrium of market exchanges, is false. What in fact happens in a pure free market is the extraordinary volatility of the extraordinary daily volatility of commodity markets and stock markets. And the guys who work in the commodity markets and stock markets couldn't fucking work if the price movements of the sort that happen in commodity and stock markets applied to their own access to electricity to run their computing systems, or their ability to buy coffee or food or travel to work from day to day. This untruth of one of the things which goes along with this untruth of the general equilibrium theory is that actually free market money-based free markets naturally tend towards all the money accumulating in a small number of hands. This is, of course, visible in the present circumstances. And the legitimacy, the ability of such a regime to work as have political legitimacy is entirely dependent on growth. That, okay, this regime generates extraordinary levels of inequality, but in spite of generating extraordinary levels of inequality, it nonetheless, with its ups and downs, cycle crisis, up, boom, bust, boom, bust, boom, bust, it nonetheless ends up at a higher level of output than productive output than would otherwise be the case, so that in theory, there is trickle down, and everybody is a bit better off at the end of the day than they would be otherwise. And in fact, there is a degree to which there is genuinely trickle down, that, for example, the technologies become available to much wider classes of people than they were at the outset. But it has to generate growth in order to create legitimacy. And where we're in now in the early 21st century is that this requirement of randomly generated growth, the requirement that there should not be controls on innovation, that there should not be, we should not say that FX, we're going to shut down the car industry because of or radically reduce the output of beef for reasons of control of global warming. to take the steps which which need to be taken in order to control global warming is anti-capitalist and requires conscious planning. It doesn't matter that it could perfectly well be conscious planning over particular sectors and particular decisions. It's nonetheless conscious planning and not market-based decision making. And indeed, carbon pricing is an artificial conscious planning decision, and so on and so on and so forth. Okay, so the consequence is we humanity, irrespective of the question of the emancipation of the working class, all of that stuff, humanity needs to get beyond capitalism. And in order for humanity to get beyond capitalism, we need to take conscious decisions about the use of the means of production with a view to whatever winds up being viewed by the majority, and this means the majority of the world's people, not the majority of Brits or Europeans or whatever, as being for their benefit. We need to take collective control of the means of production and make conscious decisions about how they're used. Okay. In this context, first point, information is a means of production. The obvious, a sort of very simple elementary example, if I have access to a supply of flint and the knowledge of how to knap flint in order to make a hand axe, I can make myself a hand axe. If I don't have the knowledge, I can't make myself a hand axe, even if I've got access to supply of flint. Equally, if I had a capstan lathe in my shed, it would be absolutely useless to me because I have no idea how to operate a capstan lathe. This is also true of managerial information. How many tons of wheat do we need in order to supply the bread to meet people in the UK for a year or for a month? Will people be willing to work if we offer X pounds? The failure of voluntary collectivization before forced collectivization in the USSR in the 1920s is largely about the fact that the farmers were not willing to actually grow crops at the price that the Soviet regime was prepared to pay for those crops, and the farmers had practical control and could indeed their response to forced collectivization was very largely just to kill off the livestock on an extraordinary scale and savagely damage agriculture. So this sort of managerial information, as well as the technical information, managerial information is also part of the means of production. Second point, suppose I had some dope, I could talk perfectly sensibly about my dope. Suppose I had a kilo of heroin, I could make a lot of money flogging it off in small quantities. But I would have no legal right, because it's illegal to possess these substances. I would have no legal ownership of these substances. Ownership is merely possession backed by force, whether that force is private force. If I was a drug dealer and I had a whole load of heroin, I would need to have guys hanging around to protect my drugs against somebody else taking them, because the state would not protect my right, or whether it's to be state force as it is otherwise. State force equally can be indirect. A gangmaster can perfectly well say my gang in the same way as a slave owner in the past would have said my slaves, or a pimp can perfectly well say my women in the same way as a slave owner in the past could say my slaves. The reason why that is the case is because the immigration service, the Home Office through the immigration service, enforces, by making some people illegal, enforces the rights of the people trafficker as if people were slaves. So we don't need to think about, is there a legal right Mhm. The question is the right to control of information and how to control of a means of production, and the right to control of in relation to information, the right to control of information, irrespective of whether that right is enforced directly or is enforced indirectly, or is enforced within the state or is enforced outside the state. Yeah. The right to control of access to information is a form of private ownership of the means of production, and it is just as much a form of private ownership of the means of production if that right is in the Central Committee of the Socialist Workers' Party or the National Constitutional Committee of the Labour Party, or any of the other various bureaucratic organisations, as might be the case. And as long as there is managerial control of bureaucratic control of managerial information, we still need both markets and the state as a coercive organisation to coordinate our activity. Because it turns out, this is Marx in the Critique of Hegel's Doctrine of the State, which is usually printed as part of a Critique of Hegel's Philosophy of Right. The bureaucracy does not act according to the general interest. Contrary, Hegel thought that the state bureaucracy expressed the general interest, the resultant at the end of the day of the dialectic which passed through civil society to the state and so on. This is an oversimplification. The state does not express the general interest. It expresses the colliding interests of particular bureaucrats in the control of their particular turf. And the consequence of that is that state bureaucratic control of information doesn't produce social control of information. We see this again. It's a while gone. It used to be bleeding obvious to everybody, and obvious, in fact, within the regime. In the Soviet system of planning, on the basis of career bureaucracies, both within the party and in the managerial structures, the result is that the career bureaucrats falsify information in order to keep their jobs, in order to get promotion. And because they falsify information or spin information in order to keep their jobs and in order to get promotion, and there is no access, there is the rights of secrecy which they have mean that there is no access to information which enables people to correct that. The consequence is garbage in, garbage out. And the planning system produces the regime which the workers characterized all along as they pretend to pay us and we pretend to work. In point of fact, actually, it's equally visible in the whole raft of phenomena in the UK education system of fiddling, the various efforts of fiddling the returns by head teachers in schools, and the manipulation of the bureaucratic mechanisms of the research assessment exercise research. I can't remember what it's called now, the REF, and the teaching quality exercise and blah, blah, blah. This is the police, it has the same stuff. All of this top-down bureaucratic structures produces planning irrationalities, as they used to be called, and maybe still are. How this is relevant to safe spaces, no platforming, and so on and so forth, is that the effect of safe spaces, no platforming, and so on, is to deny the right, to regulate the right to know through bureaucratic gatekeepers. And it's inevitable that those gatekeepers will operate, exploit their control over information for collateral purposes. There's a famous and ancient case, Richard Hunn's case in 1514. Richard Hunn got into a dispute with his parish priest about whether the parish priest was entitled to be given the winding sheet, which his infant baby had just died, and the parish priest claimed that he was entitled to the infant's winding sheet as a customary perquisite of his role as parish priest. And Hunn got into a dispute with him about this, and by way of retaliation, the parish priest reported Hunn for heresy, and Hunn died mysteriously in the Bishop of London's prison, while habeas corpus proceedings were carrying on his behalf in the state courts. But it's clear enough that the reason why Hunn was reported for heresy was not that he was a heretic, but in order to get, for the parish priest to get an advantage in the dispute over this grotesque customary claim that the priest was entitled to the baby's winding sheet. And most transparently visible at the present day in the anti-Semitism, the disciplinary proceedings in the Labour Party in connection with the anti-Semitism campaign. We've also actually got an example which Paul D'Amati has written about in this week's Weekly Worker about the Socialist Workers' Party and its disciplinary operations in relation to allegations of sexual misconduct. Abused system stuff can be either suppressed for collateral reasons, as in the Delta case, or alleged for collateral reasons. So that actually there is no separation of this stuff. Wherever you give gatekeeper control over information on a bureaucratic basis, the result is going to be the planning irrationalities and lies and GIGO, garbage in, garbage out decision making. So first step then, socialism, collective appropriation of the means of production, collective planning of what needs to be done, which we need as a matter of urgency, both to avoid generalized nuclear exchange, which is going to be the end result of the United States' policy of aggression, if it isn't stopped at the end, if it isn't stopped beforehand by working class action. Or alternatively, runaway global warming attributable to inability to control capitalist incentives, the dynamics of capitalist incentives towards growth. Or it doesn't need to be global warming, because suppose we could have quote climate socialism and radical controls over global warming measures. States could do that, but still, would we control the killing of the sea? Would that control the killing of the seas as a result of excessive plastic pollution in the seas? We move into something else. We move from one form of pollution to another form of pollution, and so on. We need planning to overcome common socialism in order to overcome that problem, and we need it irrespective of the question of the self-emancipation, of the emancipation of the working class. In point of fact, what this is a pointer to is that we need the dictatorship of the proletariat over the bureaucracy and over the petty bourgeoisie in order to get to socialism. Because in order to get to socialism, we are going to need it to be the case that nobody gets anything more than a voice, a vote, and the right to freedom of association. And to say that nobody gets anything more than a voice, a vote, and a right to freedom of association is to say that everybody becomes, to a greater or lesser degree, proletarianized, separated from the control over the means of production, which they might have as specialists, as bureaucrats, as managers, as small business owners, and so on and so forth. Second point, the question of the interests of the working class. I begin with, again, we quoted this over and over again, the beginning of the program of the Parti Ouvrier, which is the expression of the mature position of Karl Marx in relation to general orientation, considering that the emancipation of the productive class is that of all human beings without distinction of sex or race, that the producers can be free only when they are in possession of the means of production, land, factories, ships, banks, credit, that there are only two forms under which the means of production can belong to them: the individual form, which has never existed in the general state and which is increasingly eliminated by industrial progress, or the collective form, the material and intellectual elements of which are constituted by the very development of capitalist society. This, of course, leads to socialism, but the question is why. The underlying question is, why can it be claimed that the producers cannot be free unless they're in possession of the means of production? The answer is that under capitalism, the working class is separated from the means of production. That separation from the means of production, it takes place through the process of in the first place, actually, through the process of the tendency of peasant society to produce overpopulation, with the result that there's a whole load of guys and girls who can't inherit and have to work for a living. And that's what's happening in the late Middle Ages. But then it's radically increased by enclosures and similar devices of one sort and another, which transfer the access to the means of production to capitalist control. What are the consequences of that? Because the working class is separated from the means of production can insist on the personal subordination of their workers. I should note, banks, credit, etc., are included for this purpose in the means of production, because the control of accumulations, because the production requires coordination through the money mechanism. Without planning, without socialism, production requires coordination through the money mechanism. The consequence is that control of accumulations of money is ipso facto a means of rationing access to the means of production. We can see that in what's called the formal subsumption of labor to capital, the putting out process, whereby the capitalist controls the supply of raw materials to the workers, who operates as it were as a small business, or it could be as a cooperative. That was the case in the Sheffield steel industry in the later 19th century. You had a whole load of cooperatives in control of small hearths doing the actual work, but the capitalists controlled the financing, and in consequence of controlling the financing, controlled the supply of raw materials and also controlled the purchase, so that at the end of the day, the guys who at the same appear to be in small business operators are actually just getting a wage. So the controllers of the means of production can then insist on the personal subordination of the workers. We can see this, the time and motion men. Okay, this is times past. The time and motion men in the factory are the guys who say, you could do that job a little bit faster if you just did it this way. When I worked in the car factory up the road, the management kept trying to run the lines a little bit faster, because British Leyland could only run at 38 cars an hour, and Fords could run at Fords in Dagenham could run at 44 cars an hour. They never admitted that the reason why that was the case was because British Leyland's gear was 5 years older than the gear which had been put in at Ford Dagenham. And whenever they tried to run the lines at 44 cars an hour, the result was that the lines broke down. They lost the time. It was always, it's because Pacali workers are idle rather than, as opposed to Ford workers who work harder. And of course, we have this now in the present day, the totally false claim that German workers are more productive than Greek workers. The German workers are more productive than Greek workers, true, but it's not because Greek workers are idle. They work longer hours and harder than German workers. It's because German workers have more fixed capital applied to the same amount of, more high-tech capital applied to the same amount of labour. So the time and motion men, Dilbert, and if people see Dilbert, Dilbert is the American cartoon about managerial crap in offices. And going along with that, the current demand for the return to the office. Me Too. Okay, Me Too is largely about celebrity cases. And, well, it's not as largely, it's become the media version of it is largely about celebrity cases, but in reality, actually, it's to a very considerable. What's going on is to a very considerable extent the celeb end, as it were, something which is an utterly routine exploit phenomenon of the exploitation of relationships of hierarchical relationships of subordination in workplaces for purposes of sexual gain, and so on, and so on, and so on. Now, the consequence then is that the working class as a class needs collective action in order to defend its immediate interests. The dentists could walk out of the NHS because they weren't paid enough. The reason was because they had individual ownership of the technical information of how to be a dentist, which they could parlay, and indeed, actually, they commonly owned their premises and their machinery, but they could parlay that into borrowing money from the banks in order to operate. They didn't need to take collective action to walk out of the NHS. They just walked out of the NHS individually when the government didn't offer them their ransom demands. Workers are not generally in a position to do that. Some people who are very highly skilled or in particular demand for some reason or another are temporarily in a position to do that. Usually the capitalists will find some way around that by mechanizing the skill or by importing more skilled workers from elsewhere, or whatever the hell it may be. But the consequence is working class needs collective action to defend its immediate interests. Trade unions, cooperatives, mutual savings funds of one sort and another. Collectivist political action demands, as for example, in the campaign for right to work provision as a welfare demand in the French Revolution of 1848, the Factories Acts in the same period, and 10 Hours Act to restrict the hours of work across the board. Now, the point is that in collective action of this sort presently poses the question of control of information as an obstacle to collective action. So this is not a future problem. After the revolution, we tried to run socialism and bureaucratic control produces planning irrationalities. The problem is bureaucratic control hollows out trade union organizations, hollows out cooperatives, hollows out mutuals of one sort and another. And we have episodic instances of how, when the working class needs to move forward, it needs to find ways of circumventing this bureaucratic control through control of access to information. The first shop stewards movement in the 1910s and through the First World War, the German revolutionäre Obleute, anti-war, in effect shop stewards. Ralph Hofrogger calls them shop stewards, revolutionary shop stewards, in the second half of the First World War. The second shop stewards movement emerging in the Second World War after a period of prolonged, in the 1930s, in the Second World War, after a period of prolonged and successive defeats. The interest of the bureaucracy in control of information and in control of what's done, information and communication, and what's done, and so forth, is an interest which is shared with the management. And that shared interest with the management is reflected in the consistent refusal of the labour trade union bureaucracy to campaign for full repeal of Thatcher's anti-union laws, let alone for the restoration of the status quo ante-1970, since the Labour government's trade union laws of 1974, Tulra and Epker, are already within the framework of Heath's anti-union laws. Don't roll the clock back, let alone the status quo anti-Rooks and Barnard, or the status quo anti-Lord Isher's anti-union decisions of the 1890s. So I come to the third point, which is the question of working class political action, which is posed precisely by the phenomenon of state intervention to prevent collective action by the working class, which is what the anti-union laws are, and which was also reflected in demutualization, the demutualization campaign of the Thatcher government. The demutualization campaign of the Thatcher government in relation to building societies and so on. And we can actually also see the same thing, Arthur Boff has referred to it, that the NHS involved expropriation of, by the state, of a whole load of cooperative and mutual healthcare schemes of one, trade union as well, healthcare schemes of one sort and another, which everybody was willing to celebrate. But now, of course, having been expropriated by the state, these are eligible for privatization, as happened before to mutual water supply operations, local government resources of one sort and another, municipal socialism. We have to start with the nature of the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. The dictatorship of the bourgeoisie means that the bourgeoisie is above the law, princeps legibus salutis, the prince is above the law, and that the bourgeoisie makes the law. Quod principi placuit habet vigorem lex, the will of the prince has the force of law. How is the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie work? The answer is, just as control of accumulations of money regulates access to the means of production, and so the control of accumulations of money also regulates access to political power. The rationing of political power by access to money. How does that happen? Series of points, they're not in any particular order. State dependency on credit, the introduction of permanent state credit arrangements, permanent state borrowing arrangements, central banks and financial markets, created in the first place in the late medieval Italian city-states, then in the Dutch Republic, then in this country after 1689. Multi-state system, the system of multiple states and the free movement of capital means that capital flight operates as an immediate control of policy. The latest, I guess, the latest example is the defeat of the very, very mild reformist proposals of the Hollande government in France by quite limited capital flight. Sale and denial of justice through the free market in legal services, the effect of which is that the judiciary is controlled. Judicial aspect of political power is controlled by access to accumulations of money. The two-party system, in which both the ins and outs are corrupt, and it's possible to appeal for the ins to appeal on one line, to have people appealing on one side for support for the bourgeoisie through patriotism, patriarchalism, traditionalism, and on the other side, people appealing for support for the bourgeoisie on the basis of liberty, equality, and equality of opportunity. Going along with this, and I think intimately and utterly intimately connected with this, is the control of the means of communication and information through the advertising funding of media. And on the side of the advertising, it's not that the point is not that the funding through advertising leads to the papers immediately doing what their advertisers want them to do. It's simultaneously a subsidy to media which are linked to the political projects of the capitalist class, like a party political donation, so that you can have people, just as you can have big capitalists who donate both to the Republicans and the Democrats, both to the Tories and to Labour, so you can also have big capitalists who, through the advertising subsidy, subsidise both the Tory press in its large majority and the Gruadian and the Mirror. So the point is that it's subject to veto control. It squeezes out and marginalizes other voices and is subject to veto control. There are set of side gatekeepers. Copyright was invented in 1711 as a means of facilitating censorship of the press by causing a limit on the range of publishers who it was necessary to threaten in order to censor the press. Newspaper stamp duty was used in the late 18th, 19th century for the same purpose of preventing working class papers emerging. Presently, the libel rules and the costs arrangements in relation to libel are designed to make it very difficult for small presses to do business, and certainly to provide a veto availability. Capitalist, the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie then works through rationing access to political power through money, through these various indirect means. We have changed, things have changed in terms of the availability, the right to vote. In essence, at the time when the capitalist class ran things through the property franchise, they were unable to resist the temptation to shift the burden of taxation away from wealth and onto indirect taxation, excise duties, and so on, what's now VAT. And because they were unable to resist that temptation, they also found it impossible to hold the line of saying, oh, you don't need to be represented in Parliament because you don't pay the taxes. Sorry, sunshine, you've dumped the taxes on us, so we do need to be represented in Parliament. Even so, it should be said, it took 1917 to get manhood suffrage in 1917 in Russia, to get manhood suffrage in the UK and in Prussia in Germany. Nonetheless, elections provide an opportunity for the working class, in spite of the fact that they're controlled in this way. Elections provide an opportunity for the working class to intervene in its own interests. This is the point which Marx makes in, again, one which I've quoted over and over again, Marx's letter to Bolter in 1871. Every movement in which the working class comes out as a class against the ruling classes and attempts to force them by pressure from without is a political movement. For instance, the attempt in a particular factory or even a particular industry to force a shorter working day out of capitalists by strikes, etc., is a purely economic movement. On the other hand, the movement to force an 8-hour day, etc., law is a political movement. And in this way, out of the separate economic movements of the workers, there grows up everywhere a political movement with the object of achieving its interests in a general form, in a form possessing a general social force of compulsion. So the possibility exists of intervening in the electoral and legislative process in the interests of the working class. But the question is, how are we going to do this, given that elections are in fact managed through control of access to information and media, and of course there are, as I say, anti-democratic laws such as the first past the post in single-member constituencies, in the United States ballot laws, in the UK actually also the registration of political parties legislation, and so on and so forth. And the problem essentially is, in order to overcome the power of money, it's necessary to mobilize the working class at the base. It's necessary to mobilize the creativity of the rank and file in the constituencies to get more and more people active, trying a whole load of different things, of activities of one sort and another. If we look at the point at which the capitalist class was seriously under threat from working class self-organization, that threat was most clearly through the Second International. It reached its highest form in the form of the Russian Revolution. If we look at the protocols of the German SPD, I'm sorry, it's all, I've given a link on the handout, I'm sorry, it's all in German and in Fraktur, which makes it hard to read. But the SPD protocols of the SPD's annual conferences, which met annually every year, include long, detailed reports from the Central Committee, long, detailed reports from the parliamentary fraction, elaborate financial reports, stenographic minutes of what everybody said, 350 pages, just for example, in the 1905 Parteitag, complete with an attendance list of everybody who was in attendance, and so on and so forth. We can see the same thing, in fact, in 1903. This is the book of the stenographic minutes of the Second Congress of the Russian Social Democratic and Labour Party. This was in this organization was in clandestinity. So the names in this one are all cadre names rather than real names, but nonetheless it's the case that it's all what everybody argued is down in detail, and so on and so forth. So the method which is there of conducting the discussions in public, and equally of the right of the localities. What democratic centralism meant was the right of the localities as well as the centre to publish. The power of the centre, but also the right of the localities to publish. This is a means by which we mobilize the creativity of the activists at the base. And by mobilizing the creativity of the activists at the base, it's possible to build up our own press and media. It's possible to build up our own electoral campaigning. It's possible to intervene in the political level and pose the question of a working class alternative. as long as we cling to the idea of bureaucratic controls of speech and publication and media, actually we hand all that power to the capitalist class and its media. And we guarantee that although we may have people purporting to intervene in the election campaigns, they will intervene only in at the level of what's acceptable to the capitalist class. So, as I say, all of these things, different forms of control, different forms of self-imposed, but also actually supported by the capitalist class, self-imposed barriers to socialism. That's it.